Okay guys, hello and welcome back to another video. Now today we're going to be talking about Italian dialects, and we're going to be addressing the question of, will consuming content in dialects help my Italian? So recently I have been looking for sort of TV shows basically, or films, to watch in Italian, because I believe this is the best way to learn language. And I came across a show called Gomorrah, and it's like a really famous show, not just in Italy, but I think generally. Like I've heard people who aren't Italian who have watched it, and it's a really good show. But what really interests me about it, what's really remarkable, is, well, it's set in Naples, and unlike a lot of the dialects in Italy, the Neapolitan dialect is still going really strong. It's still spoken by, it's still kind of almost the first language, if I can use that word, for a lot of people. And then Italian is kind of the more formal language. But like in like most of the, a lot of the dialects in Italian, like they'll be spoken by the older population or in just more sort of closed familial settings. But it seems with Neapolitan, like people will speak it just like in informal settings all the time, really commonly used. Anyway, the point I'm getting at is there's so many commonly used, in fact, that this show Gomorrah, which is set in Naples, is almost entirely spoken in Neapolitan rather than standard Italian. And so this really got me thinking, because, well, I was thinking, am I actually learning? Is this actually good for my Italian? Just listening to a TV show in an Italian dialect. And it's funny because actually a lot of, like, the first time this show came out in Italy, apparently a lot of it was subtitles, because unless you're from Naples, you can't really understand the Neapolitan dialect. So anyway, we're going to get into it. I want to start by talking about exactly what I mean by dialect, because it's a very confusing question. So basically, Italy is quite interesting in that obviously it's quite a new country, and so before it was its own country, there were lots of sort of smaller city states, if you like, and each city would have its own language. So obviously this isn't a map of the city states, but this is a modern map of all the different dialects. So you've got Sicilian here, you've got Venetian, Laziale, Sardo, all these different Piedmontese, all these different dialects. But all these dialects were kind of languages in their own rights, and were, Italian only became the official language of Italy when it was a full thing, right? So it's almost like, obviously these languages in Italian are referred to as dialects, but it's almost worth seeing them as just any other Romance language, because for most of their, because they've evolved separately from Latin, just like Spanish and Portuguese and all these other languages, and they're quite distinct, right? And they're almost their own languages. And one other thing to add is that in English we tend to call dialects, if we refer to dialects at all in English, which I guess we don't so much, but if we did, we'd be more referring to like slang and regional accents. So like people would say the roadman dialects, or like the Yorkshire dialects, or whatever. The dialects in Italian are separate from this. So, for example, someone can speak Italian with a Neapolitan accent and use Neapolitan slang words, but it still would be different from speaking the Neapolitan language. So, anyway, that's the first thing to get into mind. And this is, yeah, anyway, we've already seen that. So the answer to the question is yes. Um, it will help your Italian if you're consuming content, even if it is in a dialect like Neapolitan. And I know this is quite a controversial thing to say, and a lot of people disagree with me. And I was looking online at sort of forums who were talking about it because I think some people have had the same problem I've had. Not problem, but same question I've had is, well, if this show's in Neapolitan, is it actually going to help my Italian? And a lot of people have said no, but I really think you can learn a lot of Italian from it, even though it's kind of its own language. So anyway, to get to it, I'm gonna sort of show you how similar and so there's similarities and differences between Neapolitan and Italian. So let's just take this sentence here in English, and then we'll translate it into Italian. So if you and I do this agreement, we will have one problem. We will only have one problem counting all our money. So in Italian, that's ora se io e voi facciamo questo accordo, avete solo un problema contare I nostri soldi, right? And this is actually a line that this guy Chiro says in Gomorrah. However, when he says it, he doesn't say it in Italian. He says it in Neapolitan. Here's the same thing in just kind of all coloured up. So ora is now, if is se, io e voi, that's you and I. Facciamo is do, questo accordo, this agreement. Avete, you will have. Solo un problema, only one problem. Contare, counting. And then I nostri soldi is our money. Quite straightforward. It's all word for word, the same pretty much. Okay, so let's get rid of that. This is just the Italian sentence. And now, this is it in Neapolitan. So, quite different. It looks quite, if you just sort of look at it, it looks almost like its own language, which I guess is kind of the point. So we'll go through it here. This is how it all lines up. So instead of ora, you say mo. And se is si. Io e voi is io e voi, or something like that. So sounds a bit different, but they're spelt. That sound is reflected in the spelling. Facciamo, again, pretty recognizable. Quest'accordo is st'accordo. One thing that a lot of, I don't know if this, so that's recognizable, but questo has just been reduced to sto. I don't know if that's just a dialectal thing, because I've seen that just done quite a lot in spoken Italian. Like they do that in like Romanesco. I've seen that, or like in sort of informal speech in the Lazio region, they would just say sto instead of questo. So I don't know if that's distinctly Neapolitan or just generally Italian slang. And then avete goes to tenete, so that's quite interesting because hold in Italian that would just mean to hold, but the word tenete is used to mean to have in this scenario. Solo un problema is the same, except you don't pronounce the U in Neapolitan, or at least not really. And then contare goes to a contar. I'm not sure if the A is actually there. The thing is, it's quite hard to get transcriptions of Neapolitan. So when I heard it in the film where this guy said it, I heard an A. I know that's something to do, but anyway, a conta is contare. And then instead of I nostri soldi, it's a sorte nostra. So, or something like that. So the word was slightly different. Here it goes the, our money, and there it's the money, our. There's an R instead of an L there, which is quite interesting. So anyway, quite a lot of differences. And now I'm going to compare this with another Romance language, which is Spanish. So it's quite funny because when I originally made this video, I wanted to use Spanish because I've always seen Spanish as very similar to Italian, which it obviously is. But I wanted to use it here to illustrate just how similar, just how like the difference that Neapolitan has with Spanish, with Italian, sorry. Um, but sort of having done this video, I mean, maybe it's a bad example, I don't know, but having done this example, it seems like Neapolitan is a lot more similar to Italian than Spanish, which I hadn't actually expected. So if we just go through this, obviously a lot of it is recognizable. I don't know if you say bien, I'll let's just Google translate this. So some of this might be wrong, but it serves the purpose of the video. So ora is ahora. Bien, I mean, bene, you'd recognize that in Italian. Si is again slightly different from se. Instead of io e voi, you just got usted e yo, which is obviously quite noticeably different. I mean, partly because yo is at the end, but even, anyway, as by the by, hacemos instead of facciamo. Again, that's quite distinct from facciamo or whatever you're saying. Neapolitan, a little bit more distinct. Este acuerdo, again, you could probably recognize that from questo accordo, but it is slightly different. Solo habrá un problema. So solo un problema is exactly the same. But habrá, again, you probably recognize it as an Italian, but it's slightly different. And then contar nuestro dinero, again, very recognizable. Contare, contar. There's a different word for money, significantly. And then just for the fuck of it, I've got it in Portuguese as well. So agora, again, you'd recognize there. Se, similar. Você é el. Again, a little bit more different. It's be slightly harder to recognize that, I think, than io e voia. And then ficeremos, I don't know how you, ficermos, how do you say it? Ficermos. Again, that's beginning to become more distinct from facciamo, I would say. Esse negocio, or whatever, esse negocio. Again, that's just completely different from questo accordo. Você só tem. That's very different from what you have in Italian. Un problema, again, very similar. Contar, you'd recognize. And nosso dinero, again, that is quite different from I nostri soldi. Obviously, I'm butchering the pronunciation, well, of all of these, to be honest, but especially the Portuguese. So forgive me for that. But anyway, I hope this is a good example of just how different, what really we're up against with Neapolitan. And look, you can draw your own conclusions from this. My impression is that there are lots of differences. Like Neapolitan definitely has its own flavour, and I definitely think it's enough to regard it as its own language. But my impression is that compared to Spanish and Portuguese, it's, I don't know, I think you could understand this much more easily, even as an Italian, compared to something like this. So anyway, come to your own conclusions about this. I mean, I know, I'm careful with what I say here because I know that the Neapolitan language is a big source of pride in, for like people who live in Naples. So I don't want to sort of come across like I'm undermining it by saying that because I don't. That's not really my intention. Anyway, so another example that I think is quite interesting in this series, Gomorrah, is there's a scene where actually it's Chiro again, the same guy. He's in Spain, and someone like this Spanish guy, he's staying in a hotel, and this Spanish waiter comes up to his room, and he says, initially I think he says it in English. He just says, because he can tell that Chiro is not Spanish. He says, "There's someone waiting for you in the lobby," and this character Chiro doesn't speak English, so he says, "Oh, I can't understand you. What are you saying?" in Italian, and the Spanish guy just repeats himself in Spanish, and he says this: "Una persona per este en el hal," and Chiro understands that because it's so similar to the Italian, which would be this: "Una persona per le nell'al." And I don't know very well bring that up, but I just think it's interesting because it just illustrates something very distinct, something very special about the relationship that Italian has with Neapolitan and Spanish and these other languages. That it's very hard for English speakers to appreciate. And that is that it's really like all these languages are very closely related. And we don't really have a similar setup in the English speaking world. We don't have very many similar languages like Spanish is similar for Italian. You could say maybe Dutch or Frisian or something like that, but I'd say I think there's still quite a big gap between Dutch and English. I'd say it's a larger gap than there is between Spanish and Italian. And similarly, there aren't dialects like Neapolitan in the same way that there are in England. The closest thing we have is probably Scots English. So a lot of people don't realise this, but if you go onto Wikipedia, you can translate a lot of stuff into just basically the Scottish version of English, which is basically just English. It's called Scots. Like I said, it's a recognised language in various places, but it's written basically like how people would pronounce it in Scotland, right? With a few like sort of words that are sort of not slang exactly, but like used in Scotland that you wouldn't use in English, like Kinrick instead of kingdom, or Kent instead of called. You know, small things, differences like that. That's the closest thing we have in English, and it's not so prevalent, I would say, as doesn't seem to be as recognised as Neapolitan is. But anyway, so I think the point is, just before we go to that slide, is that we can't really appreciate the kind of relationship that Italian has with its neighbouring languages and dialects as English speakers. I mean, you look at Arabic, it's like all these different varieties of Arabic that are spoken. You know, it's just remarkable. And there's one standard language, one standard variety of it that everyone sort of understands. But when it comes to daily conversation, everyone will just use their local dialects. And so I just think, as English speakers, we should embrace this kind of diglottic nature of Italian. You know, this idea that there are kind of you can speak in people speak in Italian and in Neapolitan. I think we can't really understand that as English speakers, so it seems very counterintuitive to watch a show like Gomorrah that is nominally is a different language, but for me, I think it's still part of the sort of quest of learning Italian. It's still interacting with this world, this Italian-speaking world. It's still, if we go back to this graph, it's still, you know, it's just part of the world of speaking Italian. So that's basically my conclusions with it. And I just want to finish off by this this thought I had about it. And that is that this was, I think this is actually a quote from some Quora person. So I probably should have credited them, but never mind. And they said something, this isn't an exact quote, but they said they alternate the characters in Gomorrah. They'll alternate between speaking Italian with a strong Neapolitan accent with a lot of slang to just the Neapolitan language. So this goes back to what we said earlier. In this slide, it's like you can speak Neapolitan, you can speak Italian with a Neapolitan accent. That's different to speaking Neapolitan language. In this show, they kind of do both, right? And the conclusion I really came to, I'm careful about this because I don't want to sound like I'm underestimating how bona fides, like how established Neapolitan is as its own language. But like, my point is like, where do you draw the line? Because in a sense, as we've seen from this, like Italian with a strong Neapolitan accent and a lot of slang is kind of that's what is there isn't a massive difference between that and just actually the Neapolitan language because they're so similar. And similarly, Spanish is kind of Italian in a strong Spanish accent with a lot of Spanish slang. It's like it's a really this sort of this line between dialect and accent is so blurred. Um, so anyway, my conclusion to this is that um, it's a good thing to do to consume content in dialects because it's just part of the journey of understanding Italian and understanding the richness of the language. And I don't know, I can only talk from anecdotal experience, but having watched a lot of Gomorrah, I've found that I've still maintained a good level of improvement in Italian while watching it. And so yeah, I think it's a good idea. I think it's a good idea, and don't be too afraid to just embrace the complexity of the language in that way, because that's kind of half of the fun. But anyway, guys, thank you very much for watching. I hope this video was helpful. I'm going to do more videos like this in the future about this kind of stuff because I think it's really important. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.